has the NYPD and the city of New York, alongside the Department of Justice, covered up the murder of a New York City police officer for over 45 years? Well, they just might have. And there's a group now looking into it. Back in April of 1972, New York City police officer, well then called patrolman, Philip Cardillo, was shot and killed in Harlem at the Nation of Islam's Mosque No. 7. His murder, till this day, over 45 years later, is still unsolved. Well, now, Judicial Watch have become like the White Knights, like the Knights Templar. They ride in on these white horses, and they uncover all of this stuff typically progressives are trying to bury. Well, now they're suing the New York City Police Department, the City of New York, and the Department of Justice for potentially covering up the murder of P.O. Cardillo. And it's a very, very troubling case. And I go far more in depth on this topic on my new show, Off the Cuff Declassified, the full hour-long show that also launched today. But let's get into the details of this case. So back in April of 1972, I believe the date was April 14th, 1972, in the morning, about 11:41 a.m., a 911 call is received by somebody claiming to be a Detective Thomas of the 28th Precinct, NYPD's 28th Precinct. Now, there was a Detective Thomas working at the 28th Precinct at the time, but he never made that phone call. Till this day, we don't know who made that phone call. That phone call directed police officers to an address on 116th Street in Harlem, which turned out to be the Nation of Islam's Mosque No. 7. Guess who was in the mosque that day? Louis Farrakhan. His office was on the 3rd floor. The police officers were directed to the 2nd floor, and the 2nd floor held classrooms and things of that nature. Now, that caller never told the 911 dispatcher that it was a Nation of Islam mosque, and the 911 dispatcher didn't know that. Back then, they didn't have the computer systems we have today where not only the address, but the business corresponding with the address or the resident pop up on a computer screen instantaneously. This was 1972. Communications were still pretty crude, and computer communications were virtually non-existent. So police officer Cardillo and his partner, Vito Navarra, show up there, and they get there, and something peculiar is going on. The doors to the mosque, the steel doors, which are typically locked, and the guards that are typically outside, the mosque security, well, they're not there. Pio Cardillo, Pio Navarro get into the building. I should call them patrolmen. They were called patrolmen back then. They get into the building where they're met by 6 men in the reception area. Cardillo engages those men in conversation. Navarro goes upstairs. He's met by just under a dozen more. He's pushed down the stairs. By this point, 9 other police officers show up. And a struggle ensues. And all but 3 of the police officers are pushed outside of the mosque. The steel door slammed and locked behind them, meaning that Pio Cardillo and 2 other cops are left in the building. And just around 11:45 a.m., a few minutes later, maybe 3 minutes after the initial call, I mean, this response was very quick. Shots fired comes over the radio. Cops force their way back into the mosque. They find police officer Cardillo laying on the floor in a pool of blood, a bullet gone through his right side, exited his left. He dies in a hospital 6 days later. But what happened next was really the travesty. The murder of Patrolman Cardillo is tragic enough. What happened next was even worse. Louis Farrakhan shows up with Congressman Charles Rangel of Harlem. Now, the chief of detectives had shown up, a guy named Albert Seidman by that time. Seidman was told by Rangel, hey, look, these people here are upset. Now, outside the mosque, the scene is deteriorating. It's chaotic. It's about to turn into a riot. And Rangel tells Seidman, hey, I can't guarantee your personal safety. You got to get out of here. Seidman says, are you nuts? I'm not going anywhere. I've got a dead cop. Seidman calls for backup to control the situation. And his request is denied. Denied. Yeah. A chief. You got to understand, the chief of detectives in the NYPD is a 3-star. There are only 3 people in the police department and 4 in the city who outrank him. In the police department, it would be the chief of department who wears 4 stars, the first deputy commissioner, and the police commissioner. And if you want to add one more citywide, it's the mayor. So it had to have been the chief of department, the first deputy commissioner, the police commissioner, or the mayor who denied Chief Seidman's request for backup because no one else had the authority to do that. The rest of the department hierarchy were his laterals, and the rest was subordinate to him. He ordered them. So there were only 4 people that could have denied his request for backup. And many people suspect that it came directly from Mayor John Lindsay's office. A very liberal Democrat, a guy that was a doormat for radical groups. Now, there's an interesting tidbit in all this, and that's that the FBI might have had a hand inadvertently in the murder of Pio Cardillo, because at the time, in the 60s and 70s, they were running their COINTELPRO operation. It stood for Counterintelligence Program. And it was designed to electronically and physically surveil and disrupt radical groups. And at the top of that list were the black separatist groups like the New Black Panther Party, the Black Liberation Army, and the Nation of Islam. One of the tactics they deployed was making 911 calls to send police into these organizations' offices or events to disrupt that event, that organization. And so the question that has lingered for over 45 years, because the person who purported to be Detective Thomas of the 28th Precinct, the person who made that 911 call and called in a 1013, and understand in the New York City Police Department, a 1013 is the highest alert call there is. I've called that once. In all my time on the street, I called one once, and that was when we were in a shootout. And that literally means you send the cavalry, you send everybody until we tell you to stop sending them because our lives are in imminent danger. The cops rushed there, but we never found out. Till this day, we have no idea who made that call. And a question has always lingered as to whether or not it was the FBI as one of their strategies to disrupt the Nation of Islam. And then they would have done it, of course, not knowing that they were sending a New York City police officer to his death. But if it was the FBI and they knew they were sending the cops to Nation of Islam's Mosque number 7 and didn't tell the dispatcher that it was a Nation of Islam mosque, which never happened, and the dispatcher didn't know, well, that would be very, very problematic and put some of Pio Cardillo's blood on the FBI's hands. Now, this theory is supported by the fact that FBI agents actually showed up at the offices of detective and district attorney investigators when this wasn't an FBI case. This was a state charge, a state homicide, a murder charge for the murder of a New York City police officer. There was no federal component here. So many asked, why did the FBI show up? And they showed up once and then never showed up again when they were asked questions about why they were there. But really, the blame for this botched investigation lies on the feet of the progressives who were running New York City at the time. It lies at the feet of Charlie Rangel, the congressman who was tremendously influential in New York City back in those days. He was influential throughout his entire career. It lies at the feet of the hierarchy of the New York City Police Department who went along with the mayor's office and allowed the investigation of one of their own to be impeded. We find out in an article that was Judicial Watch wrote on this in 2015 that Nation of Islam members were allowed to mop up the crime scene after all the police were pulled away. The crime scene was never secured. One of the first things you're taught in the academy is you secure that crime scene. We don't care if your boss wants to walk through it. If they don't have a reason to walk through it, you tell them no, and you get a ranking supervisor or detective to tell them no if they're arguing with you. Preservation of the crime scene literally means the difference between the conviction and the acquittal of a murderer, of a rapist, of an armed robber. You preserve that crime scene at all costs. That wasn't done here. And so I am just ecstatic that Judicial Watch is reopening this case. This is one that's, I'm emotionally connected to this because I had the same last name as the guy, because he was of the murdered cop, because he was a New York City police officer. I patrolled many of those same streets. I entered those exact same situations. This is hard for me to read. It's a 45-year-old incident. I was a little baby when this happened. It's still hard to read. As I read the incident narrative in front of me, I had chills going down my arm because I could remember those radio calls. I remembered showing up on the scene of a shot police officer and then racing to the hospital and then having an older cop. I was a rookie when police officer Sean McDonald was killed. I'll never forget one of the older cops in my command, good guy, I speak to him to this day, he walked out and he just shook his head and he had tears in his eyes and he said, "Cop's dead." And it was very tough. I mean, this is a guy who came through the academy with me. He was in my academy class, Sean McDonald, when he was killed, and being that close to it. So when I read this incident narrative, even though it's from 45 years ago, and even though my recollection of Pio McDonald's murder, 20 years ago, he's 23 years ago now, going on 24, it's like it was yesterday. You never forget. You still get the chills. You feel sad. You have the pit in your stomach. So I'm so encouraged that Judicial Watch is reopening this case because Police Officer Cardillo's memory demands justice. And quite frankly, every murder victim whose murder has gone unsolved demands justice. If you like this great and really important content, I want to keep bringing it to you. And I'm going to be bringing more to you with my hour-long show. And I go more into this segment about the murder of P.O. Cardillo. I go really in-depth, almost a half hour into this case on Off the Cuff Declassified. If you want to watch that, please subscribe to our premium service at www.therebel.media/shows. If you're already a subscriber, thank you very, very much. Thank you so much for watching. I'll be back with you tomorrow.